Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 12.3A. I've entitled this video, Jackson versus the Bank. This video is going to cover pages 336 to 338. Jackson's War Against the Bank. Andrew Jackson disliked the second bank of the United States long before he became president. Congress had set up the bank in 1816 to hold the federal government's money and to control the nation's money supply. Private bankers, rather than elected officials, ran the bank. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, pictured here on the right, represented everything Jackson disliked. Jackson prided himself on being a self-made Western pioneer who had started with nothing. Biddle came from a wealthy Philadelphia family and had a good education and experience in financial matters. Question number 1. How did Andrew Jackson feel about the second bank of the United States? He did not like it. Question 2. Why did Andrew Jackson loathe, which means dislike, Nicholas Biddle? Because Biddle was everything Jackson wasn't. Jackson was born with nothing. Biddle was born with everything. Jackson had to scrap, fight, and claw to get what he had, where Biddle, he felt, had just had things handed to him. And so Biddle was everything that Jackson disliked about life. In addition, the bank's assigned duties made it a powerful institution. Many Western settlers depended on being able to borrow money to run their farms. The bank's strict policies made such loans difficult to obtain. Like many other Westerners, Jackson viewed the bank as a monopoly that favored wealthy Easterners and limited Western growth. Question number 3. What was a big reason why Andrew Jackson disliked the second bank of the United States? Because he thought that the bank played favorites, that it only favored the wealthy Easterners and was discriminatory towards the Westerners out there that were trying to scrap and claw to make a living as a farmer. And he felt like the bank had too much power, that it had a monopoly on who could be successful. And so the bank drove him crazy. The bank and the election of 1832. Jackson's opponents planned to use the bank to defeat him in the 1832 presidential campaign. Senators Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were friends of Biddle. They persuaded Biddle to apply early for a new charter, a government permit to run the bank, even though the bank's charter did not expire until 1836. They thought this would force Jackson to take action against the bank. And so we call this sort of action killing two birds with one stone, which means to complete two tasks with a single action. They wanted the bank to have their charter renewed, and they also wanted to defeat Andrew Jackson. So they saw this bank charter renewal as a way to get Andrew Jackson to lose the election of 1832. Question 4. Which two powerful senators were friends of Nicholas Biddle? Senator Henry Clay and Senator Daniel Webster. Question 5. What did Daniel Webster and Henry Clay believe about the Bank of the United States and the American people? Well, they believed, I think we got a little ahead of ourselves. Yes, that's on this slide. So let's go ahead and read this next slide. Clay and Webster believed the bank had the support of the American people, and there's the answer number 5. They thought that if Jackson tried to veto or reject the renewal of the bank's charter, he would lose support. Henry Clay wanted to run for president. Surprise, surprise. Here's another run for Henry Clay. He and Webster believed that Jackson's veto would help Clay defeat the president in the 1832 election. Jackson was sick in bed when the bill to renew the bank's charter came to him to sign. He told Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, quote, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson vetoed the bill. He argued that the bank was unconstitutional, despite the Supreme Court's decision to the contrary in McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. Question number 5. What did Daniel Webster and Henry Clay believe about the Bank of the United States and the American people? Well, those two senators believed that the bank had the support of the American people, and that if having to pick between the bank or Andrew Jackson, they would pick the bank. And since Henry Clay would be on the side of the bank, this would help him win the election of 1832. Question 6. What does the word veto mean? This is when a president rejects or says no to a bill, in this case, a bank charter. Question 7. What trap did Webster and Clay try to set for President Jackson? And this goes back to the killing two birds with one stone. They believed that the bank would be an issue that Jackson would veto, and if he did, then they would seize that opportunity, show the American people that Jackson wasn't a man for the people, and then Henry Clay would become President of the United States. Question 8, why did they set this trap for Jackson? Well, they wanted Henry Clay to become president in 1832. Question number 9, who was President Jackson's Secretary of State at that time? It was Martin Van Buren. Now, Martin Van Buren will eventually become Andrew Jackson's vice president. Question 10. What famous quote about the bank did President Jackson make from his bed while he was sick? The very famous quote is, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Webster and Clay were right about one thing. The bank did play a huge part in the election of 1832. Instead of gaining support for Clay as president, however, their plan backfired. Most people supported Jackson's veto, and Jackson was re-elected. And we can go ahead and go back to answer question 11. What action did President Jackson take toward the Bank of the United States? He did, in fact, veto it. Question 12, going back to the previous slide. What argument did President Jackson make against the Bank of the United States? He said that it was unconstitutional. And question 13, what Supreme Court case would a supporter of the bank use as a way to prove President Jackson was wrong? Well, we go back to the Supreme Court case of 1819 of McCulloch versus Maryland. And back to this slide again. We've already read this one. And this question is number 16. Nope. Let's try that again. Question 14. Who won the presidential election of 1832 between Jackson and Clay? Andrew Jackson wins again. So in 1824, Jackson lost to Clay and Adams. In 1828, he got his revenge on Adams. And in 1832, he gets his revenge on Clay. How rewarding that must have felt to Andrew Jackson to get the two people that were part of his, quote, corrupt bargain, and he defeated them both in a re-election and election opportunities. Jackson then decided to kill the bank even before its current charter ended. He ordered all government deposits withdrawn from the bank and placed in smaller state banks. In 1836, he refused to sign a new charter for the bank, and it closed. So now we can answer question number 15. What action did Jackson take once he was reelected? He did kill the bank. He took all the money out of the bank, and by 1836, the Bank of the United States was closed. The Panic of 1837. Jackson decided not to run for a third term in 1836. The Democrats chose Van Buren, pictured here at the bottom. Some have said he looks like Wolverine. Jackson's vice president during his second term. The Whigs, a new party that included former National Republicans and other anti-Jackson forces, were the opposition. The Whigs nominated 3 candidates. Each had support in a different part of the nation. The Whigs hoped this tactic would keep Van Buren from getting a majority of the electoral votes. Then, the election would be decided by the House of Representatives, which the Whigs controlled. The Whigs' plan failed. Jackson's popularity and support helped Van Buren win both the popular vote and the electoral vote, as you can see over here on this map. He was able to get 51% of the popular vote and 58% of the electoral votes, and that is actually the more important of the two, getting that majority of electoral votes. Question number 16. When President Jackson decided not to run for a third term, who was his vice president that did decide to run? That was Martin Van Buren, pictured right here, the Wolverine. Question 17. What new political party ran against Van Buren, and what type of people were they? It was called the Whig Party, and they were a combination of former National Republicans and other people who just didn't like Jackson. Question 18. What sneaky tactic did the Whigs try to use to keep Martin Van Buren from being president? Well, their goal was to have 3 different Whig candidates in different parts of the country, and the idea was if they could split the vote of the Electoral College, the very similar thing that would happen in 1824, which is nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, and then it goes to the House of Representatives. And guess who had control of the House of Representatives at that time? The Whigs. So they were trying to use the Electoral College and the lack of a majority of electoral votes for Van Buren to get one of their candidates elected. Question 19, who won the election of 1836? Well, the plan didn't work, as we showed, and Van Buren, the Democrat, was able to win the election of 1836. Van Buren had barely taken office when a financial panic hit the nation. The panic was in part an effect of Jackson's victory over the Bank of the United States. When the bank ceased operations in 1836, control over state banks vanished. Some of these banks began issuing huge amounts of banknotes. Concerns that these notes had little value, or great inflation, the government stopped accepting them as payment for purchasing public land, and they said they would only take gold or silver. People began to question the value of their banknotes, leading to an economic panic. Question 20. Even though he was not president at the time, how did Andrew Jackson's actions cause the Panic of 1837? Well, his hatred for the bank caused the bank to close, and once that bank closed, we saw the same problem happen again, which is other local state banks, they started to print way too much money, and when you print too much money, that causes inflation, and people are worried, then prices rise, and you have this out-of-control inflation. So Andrew Jackson caused the Panic of 1837 by closing down the Bank of the United States. The Panic of 1837 led to a depression, a severe economic downturn. Land values dropped and banks failed. Thousands of businesses closed. Many workers lost their jobs and farmers lost their land. In cities across the nation, many people could not afford food or rent. And the irony here is they didn't blame Andrew Jackson. Who are they going to blame? Well, who's the president at that time? President Van Buren. So question number 21. What is a depression and what happened during the Depression of 1837? A depression is a severe economic downturn. And what happened in this Depression of 1837? Land values dropped. Banks failed. Businesses closed. People lost their jobs. Farmers lost their land. And in many places across the country, people couldn't afford food or rent. And they blamed Martin Van Buren, or as they started to call him, Martin Van Ruin, because they blamed him, even though it was President Jackson's fault. President Van Buren did little to ease the crisis. He believed in the principle of laissez or laissez-faire, that government should interfere as little as possible in the nation's economy. However, Van Buren did persuade Congress to create an independent federal treasury in 1840. This meant that the government no longer had to deposit its money in private banks as it had been doing. It would keep its money in the federal treasury instead. This new system prevented state and private banks from using government money to back their banknotes. It helped prevent further bank crises. Calling it a, quote, second Declaration of Independence, Van Buren and his supporters hailed the passing of the federal treasury law. Still, members of Van Buren's own Democratic Party joined the Whigs in criticizing the act. The split in the Democratic Party gave the Whigs a chance to win the presidency in 1840. Question number 22. What does the phrase laissez-faire mean in politics? It means the government should do as little as possible to interfere in the nation's economy. Question 23. Why was the Democratic Party split as the presidential election of 1840 was approaching? It was split because members of Van Buren's own political party, the Democratic Party, they actually joined the other party, Whigs, in basically saying to Van Buren, how dare you? What are you doing? And so this split, plus the blame that Van Buren was getting for this depression, allowed the Whigs to see an opening that they could finally have the President of the United States from the Whig Party. Well, thank you for watching. We are going to look at two presidents this time that are going to leave in this video, and that is Andrew Jackson. And a couple of interesting points here. He does finish as the 22nd greatest president of American history. And when you think about we've had a little over 40 plus, he comes in right at the halfway point. So when you think of Andrew Jackson, he is considered the middle president of as far as great presidents to weak presidents. And yet he's still on our $20 bill. Ironically, a $20 bill on a note printed by a bank that he didn't actually like the bank. So it is ironic that this hater of the bank would be on our most commonly used currency, the $20 bill. Feel free to pause the video at this time if you want to read more of these interesting facts. I mean, if you pause it, you'll get to read all about this pet parrot. That is a very funny story. And then we also have President Van Buren, and he's only going to serve one term. And he comes in at 34th. That is not good. He's just outside the bottom 10. So he's not in the bottom 10, but he comes in as the 11th worst president of all time, or at 34th. So that is the look at these two presidents. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.